The morning mist clung to the cobblestones of Boston like a shroud. But Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith felt no peace in the early hours of April 19, 1775. His 700 British regulars stood in formation at the Common, their scarlet coats a stark contrast against the gray dawn. The orders from General Thomas Gage were clear: march to Concord, seize the colonial military stores, and arrest the rebel leaders, Samuel Adams and John Hancock. What Smith didn't know was that the countryside already buzzed with warning signals, and his secret mission had been exposed. Before his men took their first step, in the tap rooms and meeting houses of Lexington, the tension had been building for months. The intolerable acts had pushed the colonists beyond their breaking point, and now every man, woman, and child seemed to sense that something momentous was about to unfold. Captain John Parker, a weathered veteran of the French and Indian War, had been drilling his company of militia on the village green for weeks. These weren't soldiers in the traditional sense. They were farmers, blacksmiths, and merchants who had sworn to be ready at a minute's notice. Hence their name, the Minutemen. The British intelligence network had been compromised from the very beginning. Dr. Joseph Warren, one of the Sons of Liberty's most trusted leaders, had learned of the planned expedition through his network of spies embedded deep within the British command structure. As Smith's column prepared to march, Warren was already dispatching riders into the countryside. Paul Revere and William Dawes would become the most famous of these messengers. But they were just two among many who carried the alarm that night. The irony wasn't lost on those who understood the deeper currents of the conflict. The British Empire, which had spent enormous resources defending these very colonists during the French and Indian War, now found itself preparing to fire upon them. The debt from that war had led to the taxation policies that sparked this rebellion. In the span of just 12 years, allies had become enemies, and the bonds of empire were about to be severed forever. As Smith's regulars began their march through the darkness, they moved with the confidence of professional soldiers who had never faced serious opposition in the colonies. Their light infantry and grenadiers were among the finest troops in the world, veterans of campaigns across Europe and beyond. They expected to find scattered resistance, at best, a few colonial hotheads who would scatter at the first sight of British steel. This confidence would prove to be their first mistake. The countryside they marched through was far from the passive landscape they imagined. Every farm, every village, every crossroads had become part of an elaborate communication network. Church bells rang in coded sequences, signal fires blazed from hilltops, and riders galloped along predetermined routes. The British had underestimated not just the colonists' military capabilities, but their organizational skills and their commitment to the cause of liberty. By the time Smith's column reached the outskirts of Lexington, the element of surprise had been completely lost. Captain Parker's militia had been alerted hours earlier, and men were streaming toward the village green from all directions. Some came from their beds, others from their fields, but all came armed and determined. The stage was set for a confrontation that would echo through history, though no one present could have imagined the magnitude of what was about to unfold. The pre-dawn darkness of April 19th seemed to amplify every sound as Captain John Parker's militia gathered on Lexington Green. The nervous shuffling of feet, the whispered conversations, and the metallic clicks of muskets being checked and rechecked created a symphony of anticipation that would haunt the memories of those present for the rest of their lives. Parker, a man of few words but steady nerves, had positioned his 77 men in a loose line across the triangular common, their faces barely visible in the dim light of the approaching dawn. Among the militiamen stood fathers and sons, some barely old enough to hold a musket steady. Jonathan Harrington, just 26 years old, stood within sight of his own home, where his wife and infant child still slept. Beside him, his cousin Levi Harrington gripped his weapon with hands that trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the cold morning air and the weight of what they all knew was coming. These were not professional soldiers. They were ordinary men who had been transformed by extraordinary circumstances into the vanguard of a revolution. The British column, meanwhile, has been marching for hours through the winding country roads that connected Boston to the inland towns. Major John Pitcairn, commanding the advance guard of light infantry, had grown increasingly uneasy as the march progressed. The constant ringing of alarm bells from every direction, the occasional glimpse of armed men moving through the shadows, and the growing certainty that their mission was no longer secret all contributed to his mounting concern. His Marines, though disciplined and experienced, were beginning to show signs of the same unease. As documented in the comprehensive account published by the Massachusetts Historical Society, the British forces had been marching for nearly 6 hours when they finally approached Lexington. The first light of dawn was beginning to pierce the morning mist, casting long shadows across the landscape and giving the advancing column an almost spectral appearance. The sound of their approach, the rhythmic tramp of boots, the jingling of equipment, and the occasional barked command could be heard long before they came into view.
Captain Parker had been wrestling with an impossible decision throughout the long night. His men were outnumbered more than 10-1, and he knew that a direct confrontation with British regulars would be tantamount to suicide. What they saw below them was a sight that would be burned into their memories forever. A line of colonial militia standing quietly but resolutely in the face of overwhelming odds. For Major Pitcairn, who had hoped to pass through the town without incident, this was his worst nightmare, realized. Major John Pitcairn, his Marines arranged in battle formation behind him, rode forward into the no man's land between the opposing lines. His men, spread out in their irregular line, clutched their muskets with white knuckles and waited for his command. Their light infantry companies, among the elite troops of the British Army, moved with the fluid coordination of men who had trained together for countless hours. Behind them, the grenadiers, the tallest and strongest men in each regiment, stood ready to advance at a moment's notice. These were professional soldiers who had faced French regulars, Spanish infantry, and Highland clansmen without flinching. He ordered his men to disperse, but to keep their weapons. This was not a surrender, but a tactical withdrawal in the face of overwhelming odds. The militiamen began to move away from their formation, some heading toward the meeting house, others toward the road that led back to their homes. They moved slowly, reluctantly, their pride wounded but their principles intact. Yet something about this confrontation was different, and even the most experienced among them felt the tension. A single musket shot rang out across the green, sharp and clear in the morning air. In the immediate aftermath, as powder smoke began to drift across the village common, both sides would claim that their opponents had fired first. The British regulars, their discipline momentarily broken by the sudden violence, began firing volleys into the dispersing militia. The colonists, caught between shock and outrage, returned fire as best they could before seeking cover behind buildings and stone walls. The sound seemed to hang in the atmosphere for a frozen instant, as if time itself had stopped to mark this moment of no return. Then, as if released from a spell, chaos erupted on both sides. More shots followed, though whether from British regulars or colonial militia, no one could say with certainty. In the space of a few heartbeats, the American Revolution had begun. Some were veterans of the French and Indian War, but most had never faced enemy fire. Historical accounts differ on his exact words, but the essence of his message was unmistakable. The colonists should lay down their arms and disperse peaceably. He had no desire to see blood spilled, particularly the blood of fellow Englishmen, but he also could not allow armed rebels to defy the king's authority. His position was an impossible one, caught between his orders to avoid unnecessary conflict and his duty to uphold British law. They were shopkeepers and farmers, fathers and sons, united only by their shared belief that they had a right to govern themselves. During this time, both sides were engaged in their own internal struggles. Some of the younger militiamen began to waver, their resolve tested by the intimidating sight of professional soldiers arrayed against them. A few began to drift away from the line, their departure noticed but not commented upon by their companions who chose to remain. Parker knew that if shooting began, many of them would die, but he also knew that retreat in the face of British threats would mean the death of something even more precious than their individual lives. His horse's hooves made a soft thudding sound on the damp earth, the only noise in a world that had suddenly become utterly silent. Every man present understood that the next few minutes would determine not just their own fates, but the fate of an entire continent. His orders were to avoid unnecessary confrontation, But here was a direct challenge to British authority that could not be ignored. Yet the principle at stake was nothing less than the fundamental question of whether freemen could be compelled to submit to tyranny. His famous words, though their exact phrasing would be debated by historians for generations, captured the essence of the moment. His men should stand their ground, but they should not fire unless fired upon. If war was to begin, it would not be because the colonists had been the aggressors. The British advance guard crested the small hill overlooking Lexington Green just as the sun began to break through the morning clouds. The two forces faced each other across the green in a moment of terrible silence. The British regulars, resplendent in their scarlet uniforms and polished equipment, represented the might of the greatest military power on earth. The colonial militia, dressed in the simple clothes of farmers and tradesmen, represented something far more dangerous. The idea that ordinary people could govern themselves without the permission of kings or parliaments. The sun climbed higher in the April sky, casting sharp shadows across Lexington Green. As the two forces faced each other in a standoff that seemed to stretch for eternity, Captain Parker, standing with his militia, felt the weight of history pressing down upon him like a physical force. The British advance guard had deployed with the precision that came from years of drill and discipline. Major Pitcairn's voice, when he finally spoke, carried clearly across the green in the still morning air. According to the detailed analysis published in the Journal of the American Revolution, the standoff lasted approximately 10 minutes. Though to those present it must have seemed like hours. Captain Parker, realizing that his position was untenable, finally made the decision that would haunt him for the rest of his days. It was at this moment, as the colonial militia began to disperse, that the unthinkable happened. The single musket shot that shattered the morning silence on Lexington Green would become the most controversial sound in American history.
The firefight that followed was brief but devastating. British light infantry, despite their momentary confusion, quickly regained their composure and began firing controlled volleys. Their training showed as they maintained their formation and delivered disciplined fire into the scattering militia. The colonists, lacking the military training of their opponents, fought as individuals rather than as a unit. Some took cover behind the meeting house, others behind trees and stone walls. But many were caught in the open with nowhere to hide. Jonathan Harrington, struck by a British musket ball, managed to crawl toward his home at the edge of the green. His wife and child watched in horror from their doorway as he collapsed just steps from safety, his blood staining the earth of the land he had died to defend. His death, witnessed by his own family, would become one of the most poignant symbols of the day's tragedy. 7 other militiamen would join him in death before the shooting stopped, their bodies scattered across the ground where they had made their stand. The British casualties were remarkably light and lee. Major Pitcairn's horse was wounded, struck by a musket ball that left the animal limping, but still able to carry its rider. This disparity in casualties would later fuel colonial anger and provide powerful propaganda for the revolutionary cause. The image of British regulars firing upon colonial farmers and merchants would spread throughout the colonies, transforming a local confrontation into a continental crisis. As reported in the comprehensive documentation compiled by the Colonial Society of Massachusetts, the entire engagement lasted less than 15 minutes from the first shot to the last. Ow. The British had achieved their immediate tactical objective. The militia had been dispersed, and the road to Concord lay open. However, the strategic implications of what had just occurred would prove far more significant than either side realized in the moment. Major Pitcairn, surveying the scene of carnage, understood that something fundamental had changed. His orders had been to avoid unnecessary confrontation, but now 8 colonists lay dead and others were wounded. The mission to Concord would have to continue, but the element of surprise was completely lost. More importantly, the British had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. They had fired upon English subjects on English soil, and the political ramifications would be enormous. The militia casualties were not the only victims of the morning's violence. The death of Isaac Muzzy, struck down as he attempted to flee, would particularly haunt the survivors. Muzzy had been one of the older militiamen, a man who had served in the French and Indian War and who had hoped to see his grandchildren grow up in a world where they could live as free men. His death, like that of his comrades, would not be forgotten by those who witnessed it. Captain Parker, miraculously unharmed, despite being in the thick of the fighting, gathered the survivors of his company as the British column reformed and continued its march toward Concord. His men were shaken but not broken, their anger now burning hotter than their fear. The captain's words to his remaining militiamen were simple but prophetic. This was not the end, but the beginning. The British had started something that would not be easily finished. The British column resumed its march toward Concord with the acrid smell of gunpowder still clinging to their uniforms and the weight of what had just occurred pressing heavily upon their minds. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith, receiving reports of the engagement from Major Pitcairn, understood that his mission had fundamentally changed. What had begun as a routine operation to seize military supplies had become something far more significant and dangerous. The countryside around them was no longer neutral territory, but hostile ground. And every farm, every crossroads, every stand of trees could conceal armed colonists bent on revenge. The 6-mile march from Lexington to Concord took the British forces through increasingly difficult terrain. The road wound through forests and over hills, providing countless opportunities for ambush. More troubling still were the continuous signals that indicated the colonial militia was mobilizing throughout the region. Church bells rang incessantly, signal fires blazed from hilltops, and riders could be seen galloping along distant ridges. Always just out of range, but clearly carrying news of the British advance. In Concord, the news of the fighting at Lexington arrived well before the British column came into sight. The local militia, under the command of Colonel James Barrett, had been preparing for this moment for months. Unlike the hastily assembled force that had faced the British at Lexington, Barrett's men were better organized and more strategically positioned. They had also had time to move or hide most of the military supplies that the British had come to seize, rendering the primary objective of the expedition largely moot. The British advance guard, still led by Major Pitcairn, approached Concord with considerably more caution than they had shown at Lexington. The town appeared deserted, with most of the civilian population having fled to safety, but the soldiers could sense hostile eyes watching their every move. The silence was more ominous than any show of force would have been, suggesting that the colonists were prepared for whatever was about to unfold. According to the detailed military analysis published by the Massachusetts Historical Society, the British forces entered Concord at approximately 8 o'clock in the morning. Their search for military supplies proved largely fruitless. As the colonists had successfully hidden or removed most of the weapons and ammunition, the soldiers found a few cannon, which they spiked to render them useless, and discovered some wooden gun carriages, which they burned. However, the smoke from these fires would soon provide an unintended signal to the gathering militia forces. Colonel Barrett had positioned his men on the hills overlooking the town, where they could observe British movements while remaining safely out of range. His strategy was to avoid direct confrontation until the moment was right. But the sight of smoke rising from the town center convinced many of his men that the British were burning Concord itself. The truth that only military supplies were being destroyed was less important than the perception that their homes and families were under attack. The British had divided their forces upon entering Concord, with some companies searching the town, while others moved to secure the North Bridge over the Concord River. This division of forces, while tactically sound for conducting a thorough search, would prove to be a critical vulnerability. The colonial militia, growing in numbers by the hour as companies arrived from surrounding towns, began to concentrate their forces near the North Bridge, recognizing it as a strategic choke point. Lieutenant Colonel Smith, establishing his headquarters in the town center, was becoming increasingly aware of the precarious nature of his position. His forces were outnumbered, and operating in hostile territory. With their line of retreat back to Boston potentially threatened, the mission to arrest Samuel Adams and John Hancock had been abandoned, when it became clear that the rebel leaders had already fled to safety. Now, with the military supplies largely removed or destroyed, Smith faced the grim reality that his expedition had accomplished little. While stirring up a hornet's nest of colonial resistance, the stage was set for the next phase of the confrontation, one that would prove even more costly than the engagement at Lexington. As the morning progressed, the British found themselves increasingly isolated in a town surrounded by growing numbers of angry and determined colonists. The initiative had shifted decisively to the militia and the professional soldiers who had marched out of Boston with such confidence now faced the prospect of fighting their way home through hostile territory. The North Bridge over the Concord River became the focal point of the day's most significant engagement, a battle that would prove to be the true turning point of April 19th, 1775. As the morning progressed, colonial militia companies continued to arrive from surrounding towns, swelling the ranks of the forces gathering on the hills overlooking Concord. These were not the hastily assembled farmers who had faced the British at Lexington, but organized military units with experienced officers and a clear tactical plan. Captain Walter Laurie, commanding the British light infantry companies assigned to guard the North Bridge, found himself in an increasingly uncomfortable position. His 96 men were outnumbered more than 4-1 by the colonial forces gathering on the opposite side of the river. The bridge itself was a narrow wooden structure that could be easily defended, but Laurie understood that his position was becoming untenable. If the colonists decided to attack, his small force would be overwhelmed. Colonel James Barrett, the senior colonial commander present, had been carefully orchestrating the movements of his militia companies throughout the morning. Unlike the spontaneous confrontation at Lexington, the engagement at North Bridge would be a deliberate military action undertaken by organized forces with clear objectives. Barrett's men included veterans of the French and Indian War, experienced officers who understood both tactics and strategy, and motivated soldiers fighting for their homes and families. The decision to advance on the bridge came when the militia observed smoke rising from the town center. Although the British were only destroying military supplies, the colonists feared that their town was being burned. Major John Buttrick, second in command of the colonial forces, reportedly declared that he would not stand by and watch his town destroyed. His words galvanized the militia, and Barrett gave the order to advance. The colonial advance began with approximately 400 men moving down the hill toward the North Bridge, in a formation that would have impressed regular army officers. These were not the disorganized farmers that British propaganda would later portray, but disciplined soldiers moving with purpose and coordination. At their head marched the Acton Militia Company, led by Captain Isaac Davis, whose men had volunteered to take the most dangerous position at the front of the column. Captain Laurie, seeing the colonial advance, ordered his men to fall back across the bridge and form a defensive line on the town side of the river. This was the tactically correct decision, but it meant abandoning the bridge to the colonists. As the British withdrew, they began pulling up some of the bridge planks in an attempt to delay the colonial advance. This action, interpreted by the militia as an attempt to trap them on the wrong side of the river, further inflamed their anger. As documented in the comprehensive account published by the Concord Historical Society, the engagement at North Bridge began at approximately 10:30 in the morning. The colonial forces, led by Major Buttrick and Captain Davis, approached the bridge with their weapons loaded and their resolve hardened by the morning's events. The British, though outnumbered, were positioned behind a stone wall that provided excellent cover and a clear field of fire across the bridge. The first shots at North Bridge, unlike those at Lexington, came clearly from the British side. Captain Laurie's men, seeing the colonial advance continuing despite warning shots, fired a volley into the approaching militia. The volley was poorly aimed and caused few casualties, but it marked the beginning of the first organized battle of the American Revolution. The colonists, no longer constrained by uncertainty about who had fired first, returned fire with devastating effect. Captain Isaac Davis and Private Abner Hosmer, both from Acton, became the first colonial casualties of the North Bridge engagement, struck down by British musket fire as they led the advance. Their deaths witnessed by their comrades, transformed what had been a tactical maneuver into a personal vendetta. The Acton Company, seeing their beloved captain fall, charged across the bridge with a fury that broke the British defensive line. The psychological impact of this success would resonate throughout the colonies and provide a tremendous boost to the revolutionary cause. The British retreat from Concord marked the beginning of one of the most harrowing military experiences in the history of the British Army. What had begun as a routine mission to seize military supplies had become a desperate fighting withdrawal through hostile territory. With colonial militia emerging from every farm, every woodlot, and every stone wall along the road back to Boston, Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith, his forces now consolidated after the engagement at North Bridge, faced the grim reality that his expedition had awakened a sleeping giant. The march back to Lexington began in relatively good order, with the British maintaining their military formation and discipline despite the morning's setbacks. However, as they moved through the countryside, it became clear that the colonial response was far more extensive than anyone had anticipated. Militia companies from throughout eastern Massachusetts were converging on the British line of march, transforming the retreat into a running battle that would last for hours. The colonial tactics employed during the retreat were unlike anything the British had encountered in their European campaigns. Instead of meeting the regulars in formal battle, the militia used the terrain to their advantage, firing from behind stone walls, trees, and buildings before melting away into the countryside. This guerrilla warfare was perfectly suited to the New England landscape, with its countless hiding places and multiple escape routes for the colonial fighters. Dr. Samuel Prescott, one of the riders who had carried the alarm the previous night, had rallied militia companies throughout the region with a message that resonated powerfully with colonial sentiment. The British had fired upon their neighbors at Lexington and had invaded their communities with the intent of seizing their weapons and arresting their leaders. This was not merely a political dispute, but an attack on their fundamental rights as Englishmen and their ability to defend themselves and their families. The British column suffered its first casualties of the retreat near Miriam's Corner, where the road crossed a small stream. The narrow bridge created a natural choke point, and the colonial militia had positioned themselves perfectly to take advantage of the terrain. As the British approached the crossing, they were met with a withering fire from concealed positions on both sides of the road. Several soldiers fell, and the column was forced to deploy skirmishers to clear the militia from their positions. Major Pitcairn, still commanding the advance guard despite his horse being wounded at Lexington, found himself facing an enemy that seemed to materialize from the landscape itself. His Marines, trained for conventional warfare, struggled to adapt to the hit-and-run tactics employed by the colonial militia. Every bend in the road, every stand of trees, every farmhouse potentially concealed armed men, who would fire a few shots and then disappear before the British could respond effectively. The situation became increasingly desperate as the British column approached the town of Lincoln. According to the detailed military analysis published by the Society for Military History, the British forces were saved from complete disaster only by the arrival of reinforcements. Under the command of Brigadier General Hugh Percy, Percy had marched from Boston with approximately 1,000 men and 2 artillery pieces, arriving just as Smith's battered column was approaching collapse. The running battle continued through Arlington, where the fighting became particularly intense around the Jason Russell House, site of some of the day's bloodiest combat. The British finally reached the safety of Charlestown Neck as the sun was setting on April 19, 1705. Behind them lay a trail of destruction and death that would forever change the relationship between Britain and her American colonies. The casualties told the story of the day's fighting. The British had lost 73 men killed, 174 wounded, and 26 missing. The colonial losses were far lighter: 49 killed, 39 wounded, and 5 missing. More importantly, the myth of British invincibility had been shattered forever. The question of who fired first at Lexington would be debated by historians for generations, but the answer had become largely irrelevant. What mattered was that the American Revolution had begun, born from the smoke and blood of a single day's fighting. The farmers and merchants who had faced the British regulars on Lexington Green had proven that free men, fighting for their homes and their principles, could stand against the mightiest military force on earth. The shot heard round the world had been fired, and there would be no turning back. References drawn from the Massachusetts Historical Society archives, the Journal of the American Revolution, the Colonial Society of Massachusetts documentation, the Concord Historical Society records, and the Society for Military History, Military Analysis.